Welcome to Old World Order Theology with Brian Newberry. Today we're going to start a 7-part series titled The False Doctrines of the Modernists. We're going to be covering Pope St. Pius X's famous encyclical, Pascendi Dominici Gregis, in which he exposes modernism to the core. He divides modernists into 7, as he calls it, roles that they play. Number 1, the philosopher; 2, the believer; 3, the theologian; 4, the historian; 5, the critic; 6, the apologist; and 7th, the reformer. And that's how we're going to divide these segments up, because it is a very lengthy encyclical and it's philosophically deep too. So I'm going to go through it piece by piece, offer commentary on it, try to explain some things if they need to be explained. Some of them are self-explanatory. Some of them are difficult to grasp if you're not familiar with theology or philosophy. And you can't have theology if you don't have philosophy, because you have to have some kind of framework of interpretation of theology. So you have to have both. That's why today's first part will be on the modernist as a philosopher. Now, Pope St. Pius X was famous for fighting modernism, which had snuck into the Catholic Church. So what is modernism? Just quick review if you haven't been with this channel before. Modernism there's a couple ways to describe it. You could say it is the liberalization of Christianity, or if you want to flip it, the Christianization of liberalism. Either are they're equally bad. Or the second might be the idea of the evolution of truth, the evolution of dogma. We used to believe those things, but now, since we're more enlightened and evolved, we believe this now, because this is how God has revealed truth. And modernism, how is it different, distinguished from classical Catholic theology? Classical Catholic theology views God as transcendent, as Michael Davies said it, the God out there who reveals his truth and his nature supernaturally through special revelation, through the church and through the scriptures. Modernism, in contrast, doesn't necessarily deny a transcendent God, but they would say he primarily reveals truth through people, what you might call divine imminence. That's so it goes through our experiences, through our thoughts and experiences and emotions. And St. Pius X, he more or less taught the unholy trinity of modernism, which would be naturalism, rationalism, and liberalism. Right. So those are the 3 primary vehicles through which it is taught. Right, so having a purely naturalistic faith and a scientific only approach to religion would be something that modernists do. Traditional and classic, or you might say authentic Catholicism, rejects those methods as being primary at all, if at all secondary. You could do it as an intellectual exercise, but we believe that God supernaturally revealed all truth through the apostles and the church over time, as our Lord said in the Gospel of John, chapter 16, verse 13. And that the gates of hell will never prevail, which means if God revealed truth to the church, and God is eternal and God is immutable, meaning he never changes, and truth, that means truth never changes. So that means the deposit of faith given once and for all to the apostles is unalterable, and it can never contradict itself at a later time, just because people in a different place, geographical region, different culture with different ideas say, oh, well, now we know more than we used to know, so now we're going to change a few beliefs and truths about God. No, we can't do that. That would be modernism. Right? Disciplines can be modified. but not truth, right? Not moral dogmas. So let's get into it. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel, like it, share it with your friends. It helps a lot. Appreciate it. Okay, so from the encyclical Pascendi Dominici Gregis, September 8th, 1907. Quote, "Since it is a very clever artifice on the part of the Modernists, for they are rightly so called in general, not to set forth their doctrines arranged in orderly fashion and collected together, but as if scattered and separated from one another, so that they seem very vague, as it were, rambling, although, on the contrary, they are strong and constant, it is well, venerable brothers, first to present these same doctrines here in one view, and to show the nexus by which they coalesce with one another, that we may then examine the causes of the errors and may prescribe the remedies to remove the calamity. But that we may proceed in orderly fashion in a rather abstruse subject, this must be noted first of all, that every modernist plays several roles, and, as it were, mingles in himself, 1. The philosopher, of course, 2. The believer, 3. The theologian, 4. The historian, 5. The critic, 6. The apologist, 7. The reformer. All these roles he must distinguish, one by one, who wishes to understand their system rightly, and to discern the antecedents and the consequences of their doctrine. First, the philosopher. Now, to begin with the philosopher, the Modernists place the foundation of their religious philosophy in that doctrine which is commonly called Agnosticism." Close quote. I just want to explain what he means by that. Agnosticism, oftentimes it gets confused with atheism, people not believing in anything or not sure what they believe. In this sense, he means agnosticism as, okay, you're going to study a subject, you have to start from ground zero with it, not having any presupposed beliefs, right? We can't assume that the Bible is divinely inspired or without error. We have to study it as just any other historical document, and it could have errors in it, and we have to understand it by our modern senses and our modern assumptions, knowing how to study things using scientific methods and being critical of everything and questioning everything, right? So agnosticism, an agnostic literally means one who is without knowing. He doesn't know. He's not sure. So he can't assume anything, right? So that's the starting ground which he's talking about. Let me continue. Quote, "Perforce, then, human reason is entirely restricted to phenomena, namely things that appear and that appearance by which they appear. It has neither the right nor the power to transgress the limits of the same. Therefore it cannot raise itself to God, nor recognize his existence, even though things that are seen. Hence it is inferred that God can by no means be directly an object of science." Close quote. Okay, so phenomenalism, right? He says human reason is entirely restricted to phenomenon. And this is what the modernist thinks, right? So human reason can only study what he sees and the things that are happening around him, and study through that framework of knowledge, right? So this also assumes, in a sense, the theory of uniformity, right? I've discussed that earlier in my topic, scientism, right? The errors of scientism. You cannot assume, you should not assume that everything exists and always has existed exactly as you observe them today, right? So in the same way, this is using a scientific method to study things in matters of religion, that we have to study matters of religion, matters of theology, matters of biblical studies, through how we observe phenomena all around us right now. Now, of course, that could have a degree of variance because people observe things in different ways, and it's subjectivism basically. You observe them how you see them, and your culture also affects how you understand things. And that's naturally true. So it's impossible to really study them objectively if you go according to phenomenalism. Continuing, quote, "Yet, as far as pertains to history, that he God, is not to be considered an historical subject. Moreover, granting all this, everyone will easily see that what becomes of natural theology, of the motives of credibility, of external revelation. These, of course, the modernists completely spurn and relegate to intellectualism, an absurd system, they say, and longs instead. Nor does the fact that the Church has very openly condemned such portentous errors restrain them, for the Vatican Synod, the Vatican I Council, so decreed, if anyone, etc. Let me go to that. Vatican I. Here I have my, in case what source you're wondering, this is Denzinger's Sources of Catholic Dogma. Sorry, there's a little interruption there. Sources of Catholic Dogma by Denzinger, very useful source. Right. So going to go to the Vatican I Council. To condemn the error that the modernists assumed there. Let's see, was it 18? Yeah. Vatican I Council, Canon on Revelation, against those denying natural theology. Right. Quote, if anyone shall have said that the one true God, our Creator and our Lord, cannot be known with certitude by those things which have been made by the natural light of human reason, let him be anathema. Right, so that would be Romans chapter 1, verse 20 and following. What St. Paul says that the creation, paraphrasing, reveals that God exists, and through the created things, his invisible power and attributes can be clearly seen. So the modernists, they reject that. They don't think that creation necessarily speaks of a creator, and we can't assume that God created nature. So they reject that, and St. Pius X is calling them out on this. Continuing, quote, but in what way do the modernists pass from agnosticism, which consists only in nescience, to scientific and historic atheism, which on the other hand is entirely posited in denial? So, by what law of reasoning in the step taken from the state of ignorance as to whether or not God intervened in the history of the human race, to the explanation of the same history, leaving God out altogether, as if he had not really intervened? He who can well knows. Yet this is fixed and established in their minds, that science as well as history should be atheistic, in whose limits there can be place only for phenomena, God and whatever is divine being utterly thrust aside. As a result of this most absurd teaching, we shall soon see clearly what is to be held regarding the most sacred person of Christ, the mysteries of his life and death, and likewise about his resurrection and ascension into heaven. Closed quote. Okay, so what this means is the modernists study all things only through the prism of naturalism, right? Naturalism and phenomenalism go hand in hand. So, the Bible might prescribe miracles to God, but the modernist assumes that God doesn't really do miracles. That, if anything, if God exists, he performs miracles through natural phenomenon and not supernatural. So, for example, the plagues of Moses against Egypt. I remember seeing a video, a DVD, a long time ago, produced by James Cameron, trying to explain naturally the 7 plagues against Egypt, right? So, it wasn't really, the sea didn't turn to blood, it just turned red. It looked like blood because of some kind of earthquake or something underneath the sea, which released a sedimentary rock layer of red dust, and it went to the surface, and it ruined the water, and it killed the fish, and the frogs got out of the water because the water was no good, and they went on the land, and that produced gnats and bugs, and then it produced disease and so forth. So a modernist would put all miracles aside and explain things naturally. The same thing with Joshua and the sun standing still. And Jesus didn't really walk on water. It was the water, the lake had frozen, and Jesus was walking on top of the water, and all of the disciples were amazed, as if they couldn't understand what a frozen lake might be. Jesus didn't really feed 5,000 people from 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. It was that part of the gospel. It's just all about sharing your lunch, you see. That's what modernists do. They cast aside all miracles, all supernatural things, and everything has to be understood in a natural light. Continuing, quote, "Yet this agnosticism is to be considered only as the negative part of the system of the modernists. The positive consists, as they say, in vital imminence." Let me stop there. Vital imminence, as I said earlier, is that God reveals truth, or nature reveals truth, from within the human person, through their experiences, through their minds and their thoughts and their emotions. That's how truth is revealed, not a God up there revealing down to us. All right, vital imminence. It's a very key term to understand modernism. Continuing, quote, "Naturally, they thus proceed from one to the other of these parts. Religion, whether this be natural or supernatural, must, just as any fact, admit of some explanation. But the explanation, with natural theology destroyed and the approach to revelation barred by the rejection of the arguments of credibility, with even any external revelation utterly removed, is sought in vain outside man." Close quote. Let me stop there. Okay, so they're saying that external revelation is rejected out, and sought in vain outside man. So with modernism, humanism is vital, right? Everything is centered on man. So you might call this secular humanism even, right? We can't assume that God does things externally. And it fits very nicely with deism, Freemasonry, some of the faith of America's founding fathers, right? So we cannot assume, that God reveals things in a special way, things that are, miracles are often unexplainable. So the modernist has to explain everything through natural phenomenon, and it is always centered on man. Remember that. So, and you might even make the argument that humanism is Satanism, because Satan doesn't want to give God any glory or credit for anything, and the modernist does likewise. That's why St. Pius X called modernism the synthesis of all heresies. Continuing, quote, "From this is asserted the principle of religious imminence. Moreover, if every vital phenomenon to which it has just been said religion belongs, the first actuation, as it were, is to be sought in a certain need or impulsion. But if we speak more specifically of life, the beginnings are to be posited in a kind of motion of the heart, which is called sense." Close quote. So again, everything goes through the senses of man, right? The sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch, etc. Continuing, quote, "Therefore, since God is the object of religion, it must be concluded absolutely that faith, which is the beginning and the foundation of any religion, must be located in some innermost sense, which has its beginning in a need for the divine. Moreover, this need for the divine, since it is felt only in certain special surroundings, cannot of itself pertain to the realm of consciousness, but it remains hidden at first beneath consciousness, or, as they say with the word borrowed from modern philosophy, in the subconsciousness, where too its roots remain hidden and undetected." Close quote. Okay, so again, it's going to the consciousness of man, that religion is something that is in every person, and it is revealed over time. It goes from the subconscious, what a person doesn't know, to what a person at one point or another in his life becomes conscious of, right? So, and it also makes reference to any religion. So they're kind of putting all religions as equally right and equally wrong at the same time, that because it all has to do with the person's consciousness, you see, the person's senses, innermost senses. So a person born in, let's say, Pakistan, in an Islamic setting or a Hindu setting, They have a sense of religion just like the Christian born in the Western world. So God, or whatever they might consider God, at one point in the person's natural development, brings to mind and to their consciousness certain things about reality. So religion in that sense, the religion in that part of the world is equal to the religion in the West, and therefore we cannot condemn Islam or its teachings, we cannot condemn Hinduism or its teachings, because it all comes from within the man, you see. So that's what modernism does. It might think that maybe one religion is a little bit better than another in some ways, but you cannot reject the other altogether. So therefore, we all have to hold hands and pray together to the one God who reveals truth through all persons' consciousness, you see. That's what modernism teaches. And we, as Catholics, have to reject that. Continuing, quote, "Someone perhaps will ask, in what way does this need of the divine, which man himself perceives within himself, finally evolve into religion?" Notice evolve there, right? To this the modernists reply, science and history are included within a twofold boundary. One, external, that is, the visible world. The other, internal, which is consciousness. When they have reached one or the other, they are unable to proceed further or beyond these boundaries, is the unknowable. In the presence of this unknowable, whether this be outside man and beyond the perceptible world of nature, or lies concealed within the subconsciousness, the need of the divine in a soul prone to religion, according to the tenets of fideism, faith, which no judgment of the mind anticipating excites a certain peculiar sense. But this sense has the divine reality itself, not only as its object, but also as its intrinsic cause implicated within itself, and somehow unites man with God. This sense, moreover, is what the modernists call by the name of faith, and is for them the beginning of religion. Closed quote. Okay, so faith is what? Faith is the realization of the inner truth that God has revealed to a person, according to the modernists, right? And it brings what is unknown to what is known, but there are boundaries for modernism, you see. Anything that is beyond the person's experience, subjective thoughts and consciousness, and anything outside of external science is beyond knowable. So in that sense, that's why it's rooted in agnosticism. So basically, if science can't detect it, and if a person can't experience it, then it can't be faith. Faith is only what is known through the person's inner senses and can be confirmed by science. So that's a very limiting faith, right? So it does admit a relationship with God, but only as pertaining to the person. It's almost like the God of the gaps. Whatever can't be proven by science, then I have to go inward and meditate and try to understand my experiences and my feelings, and that's what God is revealing to me. There can be no supernatural objective faith outside of myself or what can be measured using the scientific method. So those are some of the errors of modernism in this sense. Continuing, quote, "But this is not the end of their philosophizing, or more correctly of their raving, for in such a sense the modernists find not only faith, but together with faith and in faith itself, as they understand it, they affirm that there is place for revelation. For will anyone ask whether anything more is needed for revelation? Shall we not call that religious sense that appears in the conscience revelation, or at least the beginning of revelation? Why not God himself, although rather confusedly, manifesting himself to souls in the same religious sense? But they add, since God is alike both object and cause of faith, that revelation is equally of God and from God, that is, it has God as the revealer as well as the revealed." Quote, close quote. So it's basically saying a person, this is modernism, a person can read the Bible, it can even look at church dogma and the councils, ex cathedra statements, but it has to relativize it to the person's experience, to the subjective being. Like it could read the Bible. Yeah, modernists can read the Bible, and then they say, "Oh, I understand what that means because I've experienced this or that. I understand what that means because I feel this or that." Or they read the Bible and say, "I understand this passage to mean this or that," right? But if religion or the Bible somehow conflicts what the person's experience, their feelings, or what science, whatever science is teaching in that day. If it conflicts with any of that, it has to be rejected, for the modernists, because they can't have cognitive dissonance. They dare not be transformed and renew their minds in the image of God. They can't be wrong about any of their experiences or their emotions or their thoughts, because then they couldn't have self-esteem, you see. So they have to twist the arm of Scripture and theology into what their experience is. That's what modernism is all about. It subjects everything to man and to the person. Continuing. Where did I leave off? From this, quote, "From this, moreover, venerable brothers, comes that absurd affirmation of the modernists, according to which any religion, according to its various aspects, is to be called natural and also supernatural. From this, consciousness and revelation have interchangeable meanings. From this is the law according to which religious consciousness is handed down as a universal rule to be equated completely with revelation, to which all must submit, even the supreme power in the Church, whether this teaches or legislates on sacred matters or discipline. Yet in all this process, from which according to the modernists, faith and revelation come forth, one thing is especially to be noted, indeed no small movement, because of the historical critical sequences which they pry from it. For the unknowable of which they speak does not present itself to faith as something simple or alone, but on the contrary, adhering closely to some phenomenon, which, although it pertains to the fields of science and history, yet in some way passes beyond them, whether this phenomenon be a fact of nature containing some secret within itself, or be any man whose character, actions, and words do not seem possible of being reconciled with the ordinary laws of history. Then faith, attracted by the unknowable, which is united with phenomenon, embraces the whole phenomenon itself, and in a manner permeates it with its own life. Now, from this two things follow. First, a kind of transfiguration of the phenomenon by elation, that is, above its true conditions, by which its matter becomes more suitable to clothe itself with the form of the divine, which faith is to introduce. Second, some sort of disfiguration, we may call it such, of the same phenomenon, arising from the fact that faith attributes to it, when divested of all adjuncts of place and time, what in fact it does not possess. And this takes place especially when phenomena of times past are concerned, and the more fully as they are the older." Close quote. So what does that mean? Okay, from the transfiguration phenomenon by elation above its true conditions. So it's taking something that happens and it subjectifies it to the person, just like I've been saying over and over and over and over again, it seems. And the disfiguration is concerning things past. If it conflicts with the person's experience today, their culture and phenomenon, then we have to explain it away, and we have to tie it to that time and that place. But it can't have the same sense in today's time and today's place. Why? Why can't it? Because they assume evolution, right? They assume that truth changes. So the truth back in, for example, when the prophet Elijah in the Old Testament, when he was mocking the priests of Baal when they had a contest on Mount Carmel about who the true God is, when the priests of Baal were dancing around their idol, trying to call down fire from heaven, cutting themselves, chanting out to their god, Baal, Elijah was making fun of them and mocking, saying, "Maybe you ought to cry out louder. Maybe your God is sleeping. Maybe he's on vacation. Maybe he's on the toilet." He was mocking them. Now today, that's very impolite and politically incorrect and very insensitive to do that to a false religion. So we would say, yes, Elijah did that back then. Back then that was acceptable. But now that hurts other people's feelings, and that contradicts their conscious awareness of their religion. So we can't do that. So instead of making fun of the Baalites, and Elijah later killed 450 priests of Baal for idolatry and misleading the people. So instead of doing that, we should pray with them and try to find common ground. That's what modernism does. Continuing, quote, "From this twofold source, the modernists again derive two canons, which, when added to another, already borrowed from Agnosticism, constitute the foundations of historical criticism. The subject will be illustrated by an example, and let us take that example from the person of Christ. In the person of Christ, they say, science and history encounter nothing except the human. Therefore, by virtue of the first canon, deduced agnosticism, whatever is redolent of the divine, must be deleted from his history. Furthermore, by virtue of the second canon, the historical person of Christ was transfigured by faith. Therefore, whatever raises it above historical conditions must be removed from it. Close quote. So again, that brings into question the miracles of Jesus Christ into natural phenomenon. I've already explained a couple of those. And it also, modernist Christians, so-called, they put great emphasis on the human nature of Christ, and the divine nature of Christ kind of takes a back seat, if at all. So the human nature of Christ, Jesus in his divine mission learns things from his subjects, his people. For example, I heard one priest say this in a sermon or a homily. It was ridiculous. And many Jesuits teach the same thing, that Jesus' encounter with the Syro-Phoenician woman, who was a Gentile and had a demon-possessed daughter, when she was begging Jesus to heal her daughter. And, Jesus at first says, I was sent to the people of Israel, not to the dogs, as he says. When she persists and convinces Jesus to finally heal her daughter, it was then, at that point, that Jesus in his human nature realized in his mission that Gentiles were to be included. I heard a priest actually say that, and I actually confronted him after Mass about that, and had somewhat of a dispute. Because even the modern CCCC Catholic Catechism of John Paul II, it says in the Catechism that Jesus had always understood what his divine mission was. And when you read the Gospels, Gentile inclusion is evident from the get-go, Luke, Matthew, and so forth. So Jesus was not confused about Gentile inclusion, and Jesus was very familiar with the prophet Isaiah, and the prophet Isaiah has Gentile inclusion. So all these things are ridiculous. Had to put that in there. Continuing, quote, finally, by virtue of the third canon of the same person of Christ is disfigured by faith. Therefore, words and deeds must be removed from it. Whatever in a word does not in the least correspond with his character, state, and education, with the time and place in which he lived. A wonderful method of reasoning indeed. By this is the criticism of the Modernist. Close quote. So, in Jesus' human nature, his knowledge and understanding could not go beyond what his education in first century Palestine was. So if he couldn't have supernatural knowledge, and again, it puts the divine nature of Christ in second place. Continuing, quote, therefore, the religious sense, which through vital imminence comes forth from the hiding places of subconsciousness, is the germ of all religion, and the explanation likewise of everything which has been or is to be in any religion. Such a sense, crude in the beginning and almost unformed, gradually, and under the influence of that mysterious principle whence it had its origin, matured with the progress of human life, of which, as we have said, is a kind of form. So we have the origin of any religion, even if supernatural. They are, of course, mere developments of the religious sense, and let no one think that the Catholic religion is accepted. Rather, it is entirely like the rest. For it was born in the consciousness of Christ, a man of the choicest nature, whose like no one has adduced or ever been or will be, by the process of vital imminence. Close quote. Okay, so modernists who have infiltrated the Catholic Church teaches that Jesus had this same phenomenon that all people do, that he was ignorant of a lot of things at first, and through his experiences, through his encounters with people, he found God within, and his nature evolved. You could even say this is a form of the heresy of adoptionism. They often say that it was at his baptism that he became the Son of God, and that's when he realized who he was. because the modernists will deny that Jesus always knew that he was the Messiah. It was a development, because everything has to develop gradually for the modernists. Everything is evolution. That's why evolution, especially in the Darwinistic sense, has to be rejected by the Catholic. It's just modernist to the core. They go hand in hand. Continuing, quote, "Yet up to this point, venerable brethren, we have discovered no place given to the intellect, but it too, according to the doctrine of modernism, has its part in the act of faith. It is well to notice, next, in what way? In that sense, they say, which we have mentioned rather often, since it is sense, not knowledge, God presents himself to man, but so confusedly and disorderly that he is distinguished with difficulty, or not at all, by the subject believer." Close quote. So when they say intellectualism, that has to be rejected, they're saying studying God objectively, outside of oneself, right? So the modernist has to reject objective reality. They might acknowledge that exists in some way, but they'll say it's ultimately unknowable because people have so many different experiences of objective reality. And in order for all of us to come together in a common cause, we have to reject objective reality, a truth existing outside of ourself, a God out there. We have to reject. It has to be only God working through us and in us, only through our experiences, thoughts, and emotions. Continuing, quote, "It is necessary, therefore, that this sense be illuminated by some light, so that God may completely stand out and be separated from it. Now, this pertains to the intellect, whose function it is to ponder and to institute analysis, by which man first brings to light the vital phenomena arising within him, and then makes them known by words. Hence the common expression of the modernists that the religious man must think his faith. The mind, then, encountering this sense, reflects upon it and works on it, as a painter who brightens up the faded outline of a picture to bring it out more clearly. For essentially thus does one of the teachers of the modernists explain the matter. Moreover, in such a work the mind operates in a twofold way. First, by a natural and spontaneous act, it presents the matter in a simple and popular judgment. But then after reflection and deeper consideration, or, as they say, by elaborating the thought, it speaks forth its thoughts in secondary judgments, derived, to be sure, from the simple first, but more precise and distinct. These secondary judgments, if they are finally sanctioned by the supreme magisterium of the Church, will constitute dogma." Close quote. So dogma is understood only through the person's innermost sense. So their idea of dogma is not that God supernaturally reveals something outside of all human experience and thought and reveals himself to man. Their idea of dogma is one thinking through faith, that a person has a group of thoughts and ideas, and they think them over, and when the magisterium of the Church also think them over, they come to the best possible conclusion, which becomes dogma. So, for example, when they were deciding the doctrine of the Trinity, it wasn't that God revealed it. It was just a group of people coming together. They have, on the one side, you have the Arians, the divine nature of Christ being questioned, because Arianism is a very good expression of modernism, by the way, right? That Jesus isn't eternal, he was a created being. But the modernists would even take that even further. But anyway, I digress. So they would take the divine nature of Christ in the Trinity. They would go over the scriptures, they would go over some of the writings of the early church fathers, and they would say, well, it seems like the scriptures have revealed three persons in one God, and it seems like most of the church fathers second that idea, and it seems like more scriptures than not give Christ a divine nature, even as the creator, and it seems that most of the earlier church fathers teach that. So therefore, the evidence for the Trinity and for the divine nature of Christ outweigh the evidence against it. So therefore, the best possible conclusion is the doctrine of the Trinity and Christ's divine nature. But that was according to the 4th century. But if a person today has a different idea of Christ's divine nature and the doctrine of the Trinity, we cannot condemn them. We cannot excommunicate them. We cannot prescribe anathemas to them. That would be going against their consciousness, you see. We might think that the doctrine of the Trinity and the divine nature of Christ, or the two natures of Christ in one man, we might think that those are the best expressions of the Christian faith. But those who don't fully accept it, we have to be patient with them, and hopefully they'll have the same experience that we do, you see. So that's how a modernist would think. Continuing, quote, "Thus then, in the doctrine of the modernists, we have come to an outstanding chapter, namely the origin of dogma and the inner nature of dogma. For they place the origin of dogma in those primitive simple formulae, which in a certain respect are necessary for faith. For revelation to actually be such requires a clear knowledge of God in consciousness. Yet the dogma itself, they seem to affirm, is properly contained in the secondary formulae. Furthermore, to ascertain its nature, we must inquire above all, what revelation intervenes between the religious formulae and the religious sense of the soul. But this he will easily understand who holds that such formulae have no other purpose than to supply the means by which he, the believer, may give himself an account of his faith. Therefore they are midway between the believer and his faith. But as far as faith is concerned, they are inadequate signs of its object, usually called symbolae. In their relationship to the believer, they are mere instruments. So by no means can it be maintained that they absolutely contain the truth. For insofar as they are symbols, they are images of the truth, and so are to be accommodated to the religious sense, according as this refers to man. And as instruments, they are vehicles of truth, and so they are in turn to be adapted to man, insofar as there is reference to the religious sense, but the object of the religious sense, inasmuch as it is contained in the absolute, has infinite aspects of which now one, now another can appear. Likewise, the man who believes can make use of varying conditions. Accordingly, also, the formulae which we call dogma should then be subject to the same vicissitudes, and so be liable to change. Thus, then, the way is open to the intrinsic evolution of dogma, surely an infinite piling up of sophisms which ruin and destroy all religion." Close quote. So basically it's saying that dogmas do not contain absolute truth, right? So the 20 councils of the church with the canons at the end saying if anybody believes such and such or says such and such, let them be anathema, accursed, damned, and so forth, outside the church, presumed to be damned, I should say. So if that be the case, that was only pertaining to that time period and under those conditions for which they were produced, right? That's what the modernist says. So now we have to explain that away, that if a person has a different experience or sense of what that means, those things were just symbolic of the truth, you see, but it doesn't contain the absolute truth. It wasn't revealed from above. It was revealed from within a council of men. So if we must modify dogmas, then so be it, says the modernist. If we have to say, well, we have this phenomenon today that we can't explain through the lens of Catholic dogmas. So, for example, the Catholic Church had always condemned fornication and homosexuality, but since so many people are fornicating and so many and homosexuality is embraced and even promoted as on equal footing as intercourse between man and woman, then we have to modify our dogmas of the past, you see, because otherwise those people would feel left out and rejected. And we can't have anybody feeling left out and rejected because, see, they have religious experiences too, and they believe in Jesus too. They believe Jesus died for their sins. So if we bend the rules a little bit and let cohabiting couples, fornicators, receive communion, then they have to be in communion with us. They can't feel left out. If we have to bless same-sex unions, then we have to, because we can't have them feel left out. They confess Jesus as their Lord also, you see. So says the modernist. And what about the sacraments? The Council of Trent said the sacraments are the ordinary means of saving grace. But you see, that's only symbolic of that. So we don't really need the sacraments. Oh, if there's an illness going around, we can't receive the sacraments. People might get sick. They're not supernatural means of divine grace that saves. So, if the COVID-19 is making people get sick, we can't have people going to Mass and receiving the sacraments. We can't have people going to the church. We can't have last rites of people dying. We might give them a disease, or they might give us a disease, and we might spread it around. See, the modernist doesn't believe in supernatural grace. The sacraments are only symbolic of that. Oh, we don't need to believe in transubstantiation, because then the other religions who don't believe it, they won't accept us and they won't work with us. So we have to say, well, you don't have to believe in transubstantiation. It could just be a symbol of it. That's what the modernist thinks. So that's no wonder that 2/3 or more of American Catholics reject the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, because modernism has slipped into the church and has allowed people to disbelieve it without any problem. Okay, finishing up, last paragraph of this segment. Quote, "Yet that dogma not only can be, but ought to be evolved and changed. Even the modernists themselves in fragmentary fashion affirm, and this clearly follows from their principles. For among the chief points of doctrine they hold this, which they deduce from the principle of vital imminence, that religious formulae, to be really religious and not intellectually speculations, should be alive, and should live the life of the religious sense. This is not to be understood thus, as if these formulae, especially if merely imaginative, were invented for the religious sense, for their origin is of no concern, nor is their number or quality, but as follows: that the religious sense, applying some modification, if necessary, should join them to itself vitally. Of course, in other words, it is necessary that the primitive formulae be accepted by the heart and sanctioned by it. Likewise, that the labor by which the secondary formulae are brought forth be under the guidance of the heart. Hence it happens that these formulae, to be vital, should be and should remain adapted alike to the faith and to the believer. Therefore, if for any cause such an adaptation should cease, they lose the original notions and need to be changed. Furthermore, since this power and the fortune of the dogmatic formulae are so unstable, it is no wonder that they are such an object of ridicule and contempt to modernists, who say nothing to the contrary and extol nothing but the religious sense and the religious life. And so they most boldly attack the Church as moving on a path of error, because she does not in the least distinguish the religious and moral force from the superficial significance of the formulae, and by clinging with vain labor and most tenaciously to formulae devoid of meaning, permits religion itself to collapse." Close quote. So it's basically saying that it's okay in the first sense of religion to teach and catechize people of the truths and dogmas of our past, but the secondary formulae, meaning critical analysis of it and trying to accommodate that to our personal experiences of God and our consciousness, it has to be modified to fit our subjective consciousness, you see. We have to relativize everything of the past to right now, what's going on right now. So we have to make some modifications and changes, you see, so says the modernist, because truth evolves, you see. So the things that were written in stone in the past were only symbolic of the phenomena that we experience today. So if in the past only males could be priests, if that was true then, but now we have feminism, you see, and women's rights. So women have the ability to be priests just like men do, you see. So women should be admitted to the priesthood, you see, or deacons and so forth. And modernists always move using the method of gradualism. They like to simmer the frog in the pot of water. They simmer it until it cooks to death. They don't make drastic changes because that would bring alarm to people's religious consciousness, you see. They have to gradually bring it about. That's how they operate. Finishing up, quote, "Surely blind and leaders of the blind," Matthew 15:14, "are they who are puffed up by the proud name of science, reach such a point in their raving that they pervert the eternal concept of truth and the true sense of religion by introducing a new system in which, from an exaggerated and unbridled desire for novelty, truth is not sought where it certainly exists, and neglecting the holy and apostolic traditions, other doctrines, empty, futile, uncertain, and unapproved by the Church, are adopted, on which men in their extreme vanity think that truth itself is based and maintained. So much, venerable brothers, for the modernist as a philosopher." Close quote. So, truth changes. That's what the modernists teach. It is subject to the current phenomena of what's going on today, and everything in the past has to be adapted to what we experience and what is going on today. So whatever the scientists are saying today must trump whatever happens in the past, you see. So those things of the past, they're important for religious life. They're important as a first step of faith. But you see, as we subject and scrutinize and analyze those things to what we experience today, we have to make adequate adjustments in order for that religion to be relevant to us today. So that's what a modernist does. See, the problem with that is, I'm going to close with this, the problem with that kind of thinking is that if the church was a little bit wrong in the past, there's nothing to stop the church being a little bit wrong today. And then it would be subject in the future to more changes and more adaptations. So eventually you'll end up with a religion that is so disfigured it looks nothing like it was in the past. But the Catholic Church did a great job for 1900 plus years without changing anything. But all of a sudden the 1960s happened, and now we have to change everything. That was the tipping point. And the occultists, the Crowleyans, they called the 1960s the Age of Aquarius, the Age of Horus. So it seems like the Vatican II Council, along with the Crowleyans and the occultists, wanted to bring about worldwide revolution and change everywhere in culture. And they did it. And now modernism is in full force, changing everything in the church and in all religions around the world. And it seems like all religions are coming together under the United Nations and forming a one world religion, you see, because change has to happen. This is nothing but the doctrine of the Freemasons. That yes, we acknowledge that God exists, but each to his own. And that's how modernism functions philosophically. That's the philosophical groundwork of modernism. So next time we will go into the modernist as a believer. So how does he live out his faith, the modernist? So I hope this was helpful. This is very interesting stuff if you're into theology. And this applies to, even if you're not Catholic, this would apply to your faith tradition as well. I would embrace you, if you're not Catholic, to adapt the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. That's where the battle against modernism is centered, and that's where it's at. And that's the church that Satan hates the most, because that's the church that Jesus Christ founded. Feel free to leave comments below. God bless you. Nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen.